Good morning to everyone. It's good to see people out. I know it's a real kind of iffy morning weather-wise. See what happens. I don't know what's going to happen with my evening class. We'll just have to see what we get. But it would be nice if this winter would end at some point. I think the design argument is worth covering just because of the high-profile nature of it in recent discussions about whether or not so-called intelligent design should be, taught alongside of evolutionary theory in the public school system as an equally acceptable theory, or at least as an alternative. And so it's controversial, but in case you haven't noticed yet, where other courses sometimes try to shy away from controversy, in philosophy we dive in with both feet where angels fear to tread. So the design argument has been around for a while. We find, of course, Aquinas' 5 ways are 5 ways to prove God's existence, and I have 4 of them in this PowerPoint. The first 3 were, I think we might not do the cosmological argument. So ways 1 through 3. Basically, the cosmological argument is the argument that a first cause is necessary for the cosmos. So cosmological comes from cosmos, and of course, modern cosmological theories, the Big Bang theory, but I don't know that we're going to spend a lot of time on that, so I'm not going to do the first 3 ways. The 4th way we're just not going to deal with. The 5th way, though, is a version of what is sometimes referred to as the teleological argument, which is what we call the design argument for God. That is, in other words, telos is the Greek word for purpose or end or design. Let me get this up a tad. And so the design argument basically says that nature is not just a blind mechanical system. Now note, after Newton and after Darwin, it became much easier to see nature as a blind, mechanical, clockwork universe. But following Aristotle, remember Aristotle thought there were purposes in nature. Maybe we should have done his four causes. For the sake of time, I left that out. But Aristotle thought that there was a thing like a final cause, which would be the end at which a thing aims at. An acorn aims to be an oak tree. If I'm a sculptor, I aim to have the final product be a statue that I create. So the teleological or design argument then, takes its name from this idea that it gets underway by noticing that there seem to be purposes imbued, or infused into things in nature. And we see this in a very simple early statement of the design argument from St. Thomas Aquinas. And this is what we find in his fifth way, the things in nature that don't have understanding or intelligence, nonetheless are directed or act toward an end or goal. But he says if they don't have intelligence or understanding themselves, then they're incapable of directing themselves toward that goal without an external intelligence. So lacking intelligence, they can't direct themselves toward the goal. And in the next slide is actually St. Thomas Aquinas' own illustration of this. He says lacking intelligence, an arrow cannot direct itself toward its target. And the thing is, you say, well, would a guided missile or a smart bomb, now you guys were probably a glint in your parents' eye during the first Gulf War in 1990. But, they made a big deal of how advanced our weaponry was back then and how we could, literally laser guide a smart bomb down, the ventilation shaft of a building and blow it up if it was a military target. But think about it. I mean, even a guided missile or a smart bomb, well, yes, it can direct itself toward its target by itself, but it needed to have been designed and programmed by an intelligence to do that, an external intelligence, namely human intelligence. So he says, just as an arrow needs an intelligent archer to direct it toward its goal, so things in nature that show evidence of directedness toward an end or purpose also need an intelligence or goal to direct them toward that end. Now, of course, for St. Thomas Aquinas, there's only one real option here, right? It's kind of interesting that there's an ancient Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, named because 7 scholars, I guess, got it out. And in the Septuagint Greek, I mean, the way the Israelites looked at the theology of surrounding nations who, like Egypt and Mesopotamia, who had polytheistic, frameworks like ancient Greek, was the word they used to apply to these people was that these people were atheoi, from which we get the word atheist, right? You say, well, they had lots of gods. Well, yeah, but to a monotheist in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I mean, there's only one God who actually exists, and so these people may have been atheists as far as the ancient Israel is concerned. So for St. Thomas Aquinas, it's only one real option here, and that's the God of the Bible and church tradition as the designer, the on-high intelligence that needed to direct things toward their purpose. So likewise, things in nature that fulfill a purpose can't direct themselves toward that. And we're going to see this in more detail in Paley. I'm going to project and read just a little bit from Paley this morning. There's a selection in your supplementary readings folder. So basically, they need to be directed by an external intelligence. And for Aquinas, there's only one real option going on here, which is God as the God of monotheism. And now, David Hume makes several points. One, you're going to see Paley says, well, even if the watch goes wrong still, that doesn't make it any less an object of design. But Hume doesn't like the fact that, for one thing, from a very imperfect, limited, contingent world, we're supposed to, by analogy, conclude the existence, as St. Thomas Aquinas just tried to do, of a perfect and supremely intelligent designer. But Hume says from many imperfections of things in nature, we could just as easily be led to conclude that this world was designed, if it were designed by a far lesser deity. Take somebody who's taken a pottery class, right? Coppin, last week, or I think it was the week before, they had some. We have a broader humanities department and some art people there. They were showing off some of their works in the gallery and explaining things, and there was a really talented woman who does sculpture, and you look at this stuff, and it looks like it could have been done by a machine. It's perfect, but somebody who just starts out in a sculpture class might, they try to do something, maybe somebody's taken us, try to do a vase or something on a pottery wheel, and it comes out lopsided and pretty bad, okay, boom, 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 let's throw this one away and try again. Well, Hume says, from the imperfection of this world, we could as easily conclude logically that rather than being the product of an all-wise, perfect, all-powerful creator, it could be the first attempt of some inept, inferior deity. And we're going to see in the slides that Hume has even more points he wants to bring. One of the things,
So, would Hume be believing that there would be multiple deities?
See, you gotta kind of understand where he's going here. Hume probably is or was an atheist, or at least an agnostic. Now, I know that I once came across an article called Hume's Immanent God, where they tried to say that Hume seemed to have some sort of view of that would be compatible with, say, a Far Eastern pantheism. You know, that there's an immanent God in nature, that maybe there's not a distinction between God and nature, but they're all the same. I would have to contest, I mean, I was pretty busy at the time. I noticed the article, I thought, well, that's interesting. I always thought of Hume as being kind of an atheist. And here's an article that says, no, Hume had a sort of immanent concept of God. But to get back to your question, Hume's making a logical point, and it doesn't mean that he necessarily believes that there was an inept, bumbling God who created everything. But what Hume is saying is, from the premises of the design argument, more conclusions are possible than the one that somebody like Paley or St. Thomas Aquinas would want to draw, that the creator of the universe is the God of monotheism, right? Hume's saying, well, from the premises, we could just as easily conclude a number of different things. And this becomes important because one of the characters in Hume's dialogues we're going to see is somebody who wants to be a sophisticated late 18th century intellectual, Leanthes, who doesn't want his faith like Damia, who's a kind of simple, traditional believer. He wants his faith to rest in things like the design argument. In other words, he thinks it's going to be a more rationally justifiable faith if he backs it up with stuff like that. But Hume's point, I think, is made very well against somebody like that, because if you want to make these arguments stand on all fours and do the job completely by themselves, then you end up with more than one conclusion if you're going to just take the argument in isolation. So just because Hume talks about there being several possibilities, it doesn't mean that Hume in his own personal life believes any of them. We're going to see he entertains one Brahman concept that the world was woven by a spider. We can pretty much, be confident that that wasn't Hume's own personal view of things. But he's trying to make this logical point that various conclusions are possible. But for somebody like Aquinas, and for a lot of theologians, these arguments are interesting, but they're not the central core of their faith. That probably comes from revelation, and for Aquinas, probably also church tradition. And arguments like this are kind of the icing on the cake. They're nice, but that's not what they're not all in. Whereas somebody like, to use a poker analogy, like Leanthes is kind of all in on these intellectual arguments, like the design argument. Now, all of the arguments that Aquinas uses in the five ways are a posteriori. They are based on experience. They're not like the ontological argument. Aquinas did not particularly care for the ontological argument, didn't think it worked. Well, anyway, I have a whole slide on Hume. Hume, did I mention this the other time? That Hume, as a young man, wanted his first book to really cause a splash. I think I mentioned he was like in his mid-20s. Puts the treatise of human nature out there, and I mean, he wants to really rouse some, get a reaction from people, because he knows it's a controversial, skeptical book. And as he wrote to a friend later, the book fell stillborn from the presses. It died. Nobody paid any attention to it. Nobody knew who he was, right? Whereas at the end of his life, Hume writes a book on these arguments from natural theology, dialogues concerning natural religion, does it in dialogue form. Most philosophy is not written in dialogue form. From the fact that we've looked at Plato and now we're looking at dialogues concerning natural, you might get that idea. But most philosophy is not written as a dialogue. But at any rate, Hume instructs his publisher not to publish it until after his death, because he doesn't want to deal with the negative feedback. And at the end of his life, Hume has, among other things, put out a work that's this thick, that was the standard history of England for years. Hume couldn't get a university job, because the universities then were run by conservative religious believers, and so he worked as a librarian and wrote a history of England on the side. But he also was becoming known for his works in philosophy, and he didn't want to deal with the feedback, the negative feedback. So he told his publisher, "Don't publish it till after I'm gone." So at any rate, this is one version of the design argument, and in Paley, we get, I think, a very clear statement of it. And let's see. I think I did one of these. There we go. Kind of blew it up a little bit. And this is well, it's starting out there, folks. And I'm going to kind of read this. We're not going to read the whole thing. It would take half the period. It's about 4 pages. What I did was I cut and pasted really some of the real most important parts of Paley. It starts out with his noticing the watch in the heath, right? You and I walk across the field, but in Scotland we're walking across the heath. And then I cut and pasted some stuff from later in Paley's natural theology, where he kind of brings the argument home by looking at something like at the eye as analogous to the watch. So read a little bit of this. And by the way, it's actually an interesting book. I once bought a used copy of it from the 1800s. When I was in grad school, I did a lot of, I was working in a historical area, so I did a lot of collecting of, old books. So I was patronizing used bookstores. And the interesting thing about Paley's natural theology is he's got a lot of these ink drawings, of the parts of various, of human anatomy and even of animals and plants, so it looks more like a book on science, on biology or botany than a theological book. At least not in, the primary text. So Paley says, and see if you notice how he brings in the idea of telos, or purpose. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitch my foot against the stone, and we're asked how the stone came to be there. He says, I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had laid there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But now he says, but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. He says, I should hardly think of the answer which I have given before, or before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? And here is where he brings in the notion of telos, or purpose. He says, for this reason and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated. And he goes into more detail than we want to read about the inner workings of a watch. But you can see his point. The watch, unlike the stone, has an inner mechanism, parts that work together to fulfill a purpose. And so, he's going to make Aquinas' point that this didn't happen by accident. And so the design argument, the form of it, is what is called an argument from analogy, where you're basically saying two things, A and B, are alike in certain respects. Let's call these respects A, B, and C. That's your premises. In other words, you note generally one, but usually several ways in which two things are alike. And then your conclusion is, well, if they are alike in respects A, B, and C, then probably they will also be alike in respect Z. And so now Paley compares the workings of a watch, and he makes a couple of things like deals with possible ejections in the next page. He said it wouldn't weaken our conclusion that we had never seen a watch made. It wouldn't invalidate our conclusion that the watch sometimes went wrong, that it wasn't perfect. Now, of course, Hume focuses on this because he says, well, wait a second. It does matter that nature is not perfect if you're using observations about nature to conclude that the designer of nature had to have been perfect. And in 4, he hits at a point that Hume's going to make. Nor fourthly would any man in the senses think the existence of the watch since I'm going to mention these in passing, I should So what I was going to just read this. He says, nor would any man in his senses think that the existence of the watch with its various machinery accounted for by being told that it was one out of possible combinations of material forms, that is, that it had a naturalistic cause, that whatever he had found in the place where he found the watch must have contained some internal configuration or other, and that this configuration might be the structure now exhibited. You know, that something in nature might have produced it, right? And nature does produce things that seem like the work of design, but they're natural causes. You know, the Weather Channel has this thing about prospectors. I had one of my favorite uncles growing up was probably killed on a mountain doing exactly what these guys were doing. He was kind of an amateur geologist, kelp, looking for gemstones. You know, and so you punch of dirt, and all of a sudden, you know, there's a gemstone in it. You know, well, how's that happen? You know, well, we don't think it was. You know, we think that natural forces did it. Now, I can also say, well, yeah, but if God designed the laws of nature, they were designed so that stuff like that is going to occasionally form. But at any rate, Paley did anticipate some of the points Hume made, and I don't know if Paley read Hume. Paley, Hume would have published his stuff, maybe, I don't know when it first came out, but Hume died around the time of our revolution, 1777 or 78. And so it would have come out then. Paley's getting this book out in 1802. You know, whether he had seen what Hume had written, I don't know. But at any rate, he hits this idea that that we wouldn't be inclined to conclude that just, you know, things around there. In other words, we might conclude that the particular geological makeup of the mountain is such that it's going to produce quartz crystals or other gemstones just because of its chemical makeup. But we're unlikely to conclude that somehow the natural conditions of the heath are such that they can occasionally produce pocket watch, right? And he says, nor fifthly would it yield this inquiry more satisfaction to be answered that there existed in things a principle of order which had disposed the parts of the watch into their present form and situation. But of course, this is very similar, though, to the points that evolution makes, that there is this sort of natural principle that, you know, natural selection tends toward the survival of the fittest and toward order. But just want to read one more paragraph, because for Paley, the best analogy to the watch is something like the human eye. And in fact, in this quote that I have here, and this is right from the book. It's not in quotes because the whole thing is a selection from the book, right? And I put the link where it was published online. But here's where Paley kind of brings the analogy home. He says, were there no example in let me back up and read the sentence on top. Hold on. I get to do this. Okay, so he says, every observation which was made in our first chapter concerning the watch may be repeated with strict propriety concerning the eye, concerning animals, concerning plants, concerning indeed all the organized parts of the works of nature. But he particularly likes the eye, right? Here he makes the point that if there were no other example of contrivance is another word for intelligent design. I contrive this thing, I make it. Were there no example in the world of contrivance except that of the eye, it would be alone sufficient to support the conclusion that we draw from it as to the necessity of an intelligent creator. So here's the analogy, right? The watch has intricate parts that work together to fulfill a purpose. It didn't get that way by accident. It wasn't produced by the forces of nature around it. There had to have been a designer and builder of the watch to have it fulfill that purpose. And so now he looks at something like the eye and he says, well, the eye, like the watch, has, parts that work together to fulfill a purpose or function. So there's the premises, right? It too has parts that work together toward a purpose. And there's the conclusion. So if the watch needed a designer, shouldn't the eye have needed a designer and builder? And who would the designer of the eye be, other than God, right? So he says, as to the necessity of an intelligent creator, it could never be got rid of because it could not be accounted for by any other supposition which did not contradict all the principles we possess of knowledge. And that's all I'm going to read on that. But he talks about the fact that down at the bottom, the eye proves it without the ear without the eye, that all we need is some individual examples. Okay, so this is basically the design argument, Paley's version. Now, of the three things, I need to look up what the other two were, because I forget, it's been a while. But Hume wanted to be remembered in this long, illustrious career for only three things. And one of them was his, what he thought was the destruction of the design argument. So that's he placed a lot of importance on it. Now, there are three characters Philo, which is the skeptical philosopher, which of course is Hume himself, right? In other words, Hume puts himself into the book, right? And I'm spelling this right. I think it's Demia. Who is basically a traditional believer, probably of, an evangelical Christian, right? Now, I think this is a pejorative term because I think he also suggest that somebody who has that kind of a simple faith is small-minded. Damia, diminished, small. The other word, the other character is some of the things God has human attributes, like love, benevolence, caring, and this is suggestive in this made-up name. The Greek word for human beings or man in the generic sense is hoanthropos, from which we get words like anthropology, right, the study of human culture. And theism, theis is hotheos, is the Greek word for God, right? So, in this name, you get the fact that Cleanthes is someone who wants to put human-like attributes onto God. But he also is the more intellectual one. He's the one whose faith he would like to rest on things like the design argument as more rational than, say, belief in a miracle as the foundation of faith. Now Hume elsewhere does, has a classic discussion of miracles and to what extent can we appeal to a miracle as the basis of our faith. Has a whole essay on that, which is another topic in the philosophy of religion. But as I said, we're just kind of giving you a taste of some of the debate that's going on in the area, and we just, in an intro class, can't cover everything. But these are the three characters in the dialogue. Now, what Hume does here is, and he puts into the mouth of Cleanthes basically the design argument, right? This is a good practice for writing even a short essay, but certainly for writing something like a term paper. You find it in professional articles in philosophy journals, or if somebody's writing on someone else or on a particular discussion or argument, they first summarize what it is they're talking about, the position that they're going to maybe criticize or evaluate or analyze. And this does two things. One, for somebody who's unfamiliar with the discussion, it brings somebody up to speed. I mean, if somebody's, say, thumbing through a journal and they find the article interesting, but they're not up to speed with the debate in a particular area, it brings somebody up to speed. But it also lets the reader know how you interpret someone. In other words, do you have it right, the position you're criticizing? So this is a good practice, and so we get a kind of summary of the design argument, that the world, that we have a clockwork universe, right? Now remember, this is post-Newton, that the world is like a machine subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines. And all these machines and their parts are admirably and accurately adjusted to one another, just like the parts of the watch, right? Here, the little machines of the eye and the ear or the body. That is, they're adjusted to one another to bring about the fulfillment of a particular purpose. Throughout nature, means like the way the parts of the eye work together adapted toward ends or goals or purposes in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design. That the eye and ear are like the watch in that they have parts that work toward a particular purpose or end, but they're more complex than something that's the product of human design like a watch. And so one of the things we're to conclude from that is that the designer of the world not only has an intelligence like human intelligence, but since the products of design in nature are more complex than the products of human design, the designer has a larger intelligence. And this is basically what's brought out. So the effects, the products of design resemble each other. By analogy, the causes, the designers must resemble each other also. So the author of nature, note the capitals, Hume means God, has a mind that's like the human mind, only God has larger faculties, that God has a greater intelligence. And we get this from the fact that the products of divine design are grander, more intricate than the products of human design like the watch. So the conclusion then attributes human-like qualities to God, that God, not only that God exists, but that God has an intelligence similar to human intelligence. Sometimes it's pointless to do anything, more often not. So there's the analogy. Now, Damia is a pretty traditional believer, but he also likes things like the analogical argument. Damia wants to see God's existence proved with the certainty of a mathematical axiom, mathematical proof. And what he doesn't like about the design argument, and arguments like it, is that they're basically probabilistic. And they are. They're what logicians call inductive arguments. In other words, arguments from analogy say, well, okay, A is like B in certain respects, therefore probably A is like B in at least one further respect. But it only proves that with probability, not with absolute certainty. So what he doesn't like is that arguments like the design argument are a posteriori, that is, they're after and based on experience, and he says it also depends on an observed similarity of the deity to men. As such, it is only a probabilistic argument. Right? It can only show that probably the works of nature had a designer. In other words, at best, it's only going to show this. It's not going to show that with absolute certainty works of nature had a designer. Now, the modern versions of the design argument try to show this, not with absolute certainty, but that the alternative has such a long chance to have been realized that it's almost certain that it's design. At least that's the point of the see a necessary a priori demonstration of God's existence, like the ontological argument. And it's funny, Hume tried twice to get a job at a regular philosophy department, once at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and another at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. Failed both times because the situation was the opposite of what it is now, right? It would be very hard for a very outspoken, very conservative evangelical Christian or even conservative Jewish believer to get a job in a secular philosophy department, because most of the people in the department are secularists, and they wouldn't want that type of person there. Whereas in Hume's day, it was just the opposite. The people who ran the universities had deep-rooted conservative religious convictions, were conservative Christians, basically. And one of the parts of the job description of one of these things that Hume applied for was that on Wednesday mornings, the person, the professor, would lecture the entire student body on the truth of the Christian religion. Now remember that this is in the British Isles, where there is an established state church, right? So this is in line with that. But the interesting thing is, scholars dredged up a letter. It was more like a review that Hume had published anonymously, as if it came from somebody else talking about Hume, trying to improve Hume's chances of getting the job. And one of the things it says, well, it's wrong to call this guy an atheist. What he did was he offered some arguments against some of these a priori arguments for the existence of God, But it sort of indicates that he might have had a better view of something like the design argument, a posteriori arguments. And this was published as if it was from somebody else, but scholars studying Hume's, letters and artifacts realized that it was Hume that got this out, trying to improve his chances, which didn't work. But at any rate, so Philo is not as worried that it's a probabilistic argument, that it's an argument from analogy, but he thinks it's a bad argument from analogy. In other words, with inductive arguments, you can have good ones and bad ones. With deductive arguments, like the ontological argument, it's all or nothing. The argument either is good and it proves its conclusion with absolute certainty, or it isn't good at all. Whereas with inductive arguments, you have degrees of strength. In other words, suppose I had 100 marbles in a box, and I didn't know what color they were, and I could only pull them out blindly, one at a time. Well, you could form an inductive argument, sometimes called induction by enumeration. Suppose I pulled 10 of them out, and they were all black. So you say, well, based on 10 marbles, I conclude that probably all of the marbles in the box are black. Well, that's a pretty weak argument from just 10 of them to conclude that they're all one particular color just because the first 10 were. But now suppose you pulled out 50 of them, and they were all black. Now stronger argument. You know, additional information can improve, can strengthen an inductive argument. And if you pulled out 75 of them and they were all black, then you're on pretty good ground concluding that every one in the box was black. And likely if you pulled out 90 of them, your argument the first 90 were black, therefore all of them, all 100 of them are black, is really strong. But, you know, and so inductive arguments can vary in strength, and analogies can vary in strength, and this is going to be Hume's point, depending on how alike the things really are that you're comparing in the analogy. But now, suppose I pulled out 99 marbles out of the box and they're all black, and I say, you know, probably all 100 of them are black. Does that prove its conclusion with absolute certainty? In other words, is it at least conceivably possible, even if highly unlikely, that you've got 99 black marbles in the box and one white? And just by chance, the white one is the only one left. It's at least conceivably possible. So even if I pulled out 99 of them, it doesn't mean that I can conclude with absolute certainty that all 100 of them are black. But Hume, at the end of his life, knew that there were good and bad inductive arguments. Now see, early on, he tried to argue that every inductive argument is bad because they all try to go beyond the premises. They all have a conclusion that's beyond the premises. That just because water, every time I try it, or every time we measure it at absolute sea level, boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees centigrade, Hume would say, well, still possible, but the next time you do it, that's not going to happen. And you'd say, well, but aren't the laws of nature uniform? And Hume would say, well, how do you know that the laws of nature are uniform if it's not by arguing inductively to that conclusion? But if that's the case, you can't use the uniformity of nature to defend probabilistic reasoning. At any rate, we're not even going to go there. But early in his life, Hume seemed to dismiss all probable arguments, whereas later he realizes, as a more mature man, look, there are some pretty good inductive arguments around. There are some good analogies around. You know, if I strike a match on the striker and it lights, and I've done this hundreds of times before, I have pretty good confidence that it's going to happen the next time. You know, if the match isn't wet or something. But analogies are good or bad depending on how alike the things are that you're comparing. And what Hume is going to try to say is, the more unlike they are, the worse is your argument from analogy. So he says the objects that the design argument talks about are not as strong as other probable arguments. That a stone will fall, right? I was looking at this thing on the Weather Channel about prospectors, and they get worried about rocks above them if they're on a ledge. There were some idiots. I mean, you have to call them idiots. It's like, what were they thinking of? That tiptoe some kind of big stone, part of a rock formation in a national park that I guess tourists would go and look at, and they tip over this big rock, 3 or 4 big 200-pound guys, right? And the idiots videotape it and put it on Facebook, and so they get charged with felonious mischief, and convicted because the evidence is out there on Facebook, right? But we know what's going to happen if a stone looses itself; it's going to fall, right? We know that fire will burn us. If I'm going to light a candle with a match, I know not to hold the match too long, or it's going to burn my finger. That the earth is solid, and why? Well, Hume says here we're really comparing, as we would say in common sense. Well, this thing, you get far away from it and it loses its audio. It's probably going to drop out. But the point is, these are based on very similar cases, right? We're comparing apples with apples, so to speak. What Hume is going to basically argue is that in the design argument, we're comparing apples with oranges, that they're not similar. And also, these are based on thousands of observations. Now, I mean, we used to talk about a joke for a final exam. It takes a while, describe the universe and give 2 examples. Well, that would take a while. You'd probably need more than 2 hours. But also, Hume's point is, while we may have seen what happens when a stone rolls down a hill or falls, while we may have seen what happens if we hold a match too long in our hands, and there are repeated examples of this, we have not been around to observe several examples of universes being created and observe that, well, this one needed a designer, and that one needed a designer, and that one needed it. So they must all need a designer. Hume says, we only have one example. Now we're not even going to go where and I can't believe they're seriously talking about alternative universes. I mean, when I studied modal logic and what's called possible world semantics, one way of interpreting modal logic is that necessary statements are true in every possible world. But it seems to say that somehow possible worlds exist. In other words, that there is a possible world, in which Virginia lost and didn't get into the Sweet 16. And by the way, I went to Kentucky for a year of grad school, and they are in the Sweet 16. And Virginia is in the Sweet 16. So certainly a key to schools getting into the Sweet 16 in 2014 is to have had Vic Morawski do graduate work with this. I think there's definitely a causal connection there. This is what's called a false cause fallacy in logic. Non-causa pro causa. Putting something for a cause which isn't a cause at all, right? Like when I wear my favorite shirt and the Ravens win, or something like that. I love those very superstitious ads, right? They hit at this, the idea that it's only weird if it doesn't work, right? When people do various things to try to help their sports teams out. Well, anyway, to get back to this, Hume says, look, unlike some of those other examples, we only have one example to go by, our present universe, that's the only example of design, if it is. So it may be only a weak analogy because we're also not comparing similar things. And we're going to see that Hume tries to make the point that it's different to compare the design of the universe to the building of a house, for instance. But Hume goes off to try to educate his readers on what makes a good or a bad analogy. And what he says is, if you depart from the similarity, if you're comparing things that are not as similar, then your conclusion and your whole argument is much weaker, right? I mean, from the fact that I have blood circulating in me, I mean, suppose there were a blood drive on campus, and I know I can give blood. I've got blood in my veins. You all are human beings, too. Chances are pretty doggone good that you've got blood in your veins and that you could give blood, too, if you wanted to. Right? So departing from the similarity of compared cases diminishes the evidence. And Hume says, here's an example. Consider the circulation of blood. So Hume says there are good arguments from analogy, right? If we compare how blood circulates in one human to how it does in another human, we're on really good ground, to say, well, it's pretty much the same. But he says, you might still have a reasonably good argument if you, he says it's only a presumption, but a strong one to conclude that human blood circulation is like what you might observe in a frog. And I don't even know if they allow people to do stuff. I remember in high school, where they dissect a frog while the frog is still alive, and you see his heart beating there, say, well, it's got a circulatory system. So from examining other animals, you can conclude that they have a circulation of blood just like we do. Now, remember, these analogies break down, right? I mean, this happens all the time, and this is why to get a drug approved, you need more than just the fact that you tested it on lab rats and it worked, right? Because there are dissimilarities between the anatomy of an animal like a rat and human anatomy. I mean, we all know not to give our dogs chocolate because the chocolate's bad, even poisonous for a dog, whereas, for us that's not the case. So just because the drug works in lab rats, we can't automatically conclude that it works in human beings. We need human clinical trials. But Hume says, you could compare the circulation of blood in animals with that in humans, and you've still got a pretty good argument. But he says, suppose you took something that's very unlike a human being, right? I look out the window, and there's a tree right outside the window there, and it has no leaves on it. Well, you all know one of the reasons why it has no leaves on it is, when winter starts coming on in the fall, the sap goes down to the roots, right? Then it will come back up again in the spring. So he says, even though there might be some analogies, like that sap runs in channels in the stalks of a plant, it would be wrong to look at a plant or to look at us and conclude that the circulation of sap in vegetables is something like the circulation of blood in human beings. here you're comparing two very different things. And of course, what is the additional point Hume is making here? Not only would it be a weak conclusion to conclude from what happens with us and animals that sap circulates in vegetables like blood in animals, but it would also be a wrong conclusion. So a weak argument from analogy, not only does it not support the conclusion you want to draw, but you may actually draw a wrong conclusion. Think about Hume as a skeptic regarding the existence of God, right? And so he says we need similar causes of similar effects. I have a home. I inherited it. Its records go back to 1900, but it's probably older than that. It's an old home in the city, right? And the thing is, I still assume that there was a builder and designer of the homes. Every new home we see needed a builder and designer. So somebody in the late 1800s must have designed and built that home, right? On seeing a house, we conclude, and these pages refer to a text I used at the time up in Carroll County when I made up, where there was a long selection from Hume's dialogues. We conclude with greatest certainty that it had a builder, right? Houses we have observed in the past have had builders, so this one must have had one too. But Hume's point is, well, to what extent is the universe like a house? He thinks that we're comparing dissimilar things. And so he says the presumption that they're similar, a house needed a designer, so the universe needed a designer. Well, he says you're comparing apples with oranges here, two dissimilar things. So he says the presumption of a similar cause is only a guess, conjecture, presumption. So he says it's not a good analogy. But again, is Paley on better ground if he takes something like, a watch and compares it with the eye? Now, of course, evolutionists would say, well, he's not even on good ground there because we can tell a story of how a more complex eye can form over millions of years by natural selection and chance from simpler eyes. And so, but at any rate, so this is one of Hume's points. And also, he tries to say that even if you have order, you don't necessarily have conscious design, right? I mean, even so Philo and Cleanthes agree that the following is only proof of design as shown by experience to proceed from it. Order, arrangement. Again, adjustment to final causes means, that it has parts that work toward a purpose or an end. So here, he makes the point that Paley says we reject about the watch, that there could be something internal to matter itself that would cause this. But of course, this is one of the chief assumptions. Now remember, here's Hume writing in the late 1700s, and Darwin publishes in the 1840s. So Hume's writing almost 50 years before Darwin, but he's making a similar point, that it's possible that there might be something internal to matter itself. So what Hume is saying is, even if we observe order, there are other conclusions that are possible than that, that order was brought about by deliberate, design. So he says, for all we know, matter may cause its own order as well as mind. Elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal material cause. And of course, this happens in the formation of a gemstone or a crystal. So what is his point here? Here again, it's a logical point. Hume, unlike Darwin, now Darwin is saying, well, yes, there are internal causes in the material world that can produce these things, and I'm going to show you how that comes about through, natural selection, survival of the fittest, adaptation over time. Hume, a non-scientist, is merely trying to make a logical point. And he's trying to say, well, even if you do have order, there are more conclusions for that order that are possible than that the order is the result of deliberate design. So he says these other options are as easy to conceive as that the divine mind is the source. I think that's of. So, and I say no similar claims to Darwinism. Now here again, you've got Hume as a non-scientist, but he just speculates. It's not that he knows, but he says, well, look, nature has a lot of forces, causal principles, things like heat and cold, attraction and repulsion and magnetism, and others. And he says design is only one of them. Some things in nature affect others by design, but it's illegitimate to reason that all do. He says it wrongly goes from the part to the whole, from making a conclusion about all of nature from the fact that there's design somewhere. So it's like drawing conclusions about the generation of a human being from that of a hair. So now it's interesting, and we only have a few minutes. Maybe we can do it. But Cleanthes actually brings up the issue of the eye in their discussion. Now, whether Paley was influenced by this or whether Paley, independently talked about it, Cleanthes' argument here is basically Paley's. That there are lots of examples of design, like the eye and the ear. The eye has a structure that implies a contriver that is a product of design. It is the most obvious conclusion, just as that the eye is a product of design. So he says frivolous, abstruse arguments of the skeptic, like Philo against design, are less easily arrived at and obvious. And he also says, human sexuality is another example of design. We'll leave off there, but I may, there's a little across on the internet, but I had on the fine tuning arguments, which might be worth spending a little bit of time on. It's one way. It was mentioned in that video we saw, and it's one way that the design argument is argued for today. Okay. Well, look. If you so again, the selection from Paley is visible to you in Blackboard, and we'll move on, but we'll try to finish up with the design argument next time. And if anybody needs time involved, do it on the way out. And thanks a lot for coming out on such an iffy day. It stopped snowing for now.